Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion that sheds light on big questions currently facing researchers, policymakers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions of international affairs, including Warwick University in the UK, the Balsillie School in Canada, the American University in the United States, the ISA in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Ritsumeikan University in Japan, and Konstanz University in Germany. Today's session, a very timely session, is entitled The Global Impact of the US Elections. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, and I'm delighted to be moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those of you who are tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the actions we take here in Canada to advance the reconciliation between settler Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous peoples have right to this land. The Balsillie School sits on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, and which includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. This is a traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in everything we do, including Global Insights. We're privileged today to host well-known experts on US foreign policy, multilateralism, and international cooperation. Patricia Goff is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the Wilfrid Laurier University. She's also a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Dr. Goff specializes in international political economy, international relations theory, international organizations with a particular interest in trade, intellectual property, and the cultural capacity of international organizations. Trevor McCriskin is Associate Professor, US Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, where he researches US foreign policy and the US politics and culture. Jordan Tama is Associate Professor at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington. His teaching and research focuses on the politics and process of US foreign policy. Mitoji Yabunaka is Visiting Professor at the Ritsumeikan University in Japan, Specially Appointed Professor at Osaka University, and former Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs in Japan. Professor Yabunaka's public service career has spanned 5 decades and includes serving as Director General of the Asian and Oceanic Affairs Bureau, Chief Representative of the Japanese government at the Six-Party Talks on North Korean nuclear issue, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs at G8 Summit Sherpa, and Chief Negotiator of the Economic Partnership Agreement with Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. His most recent work is New Rules for Japan in the Trump Era. So thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you focused on this timely issue. So the dust is still settling. We're not going to know the final results until all of the ballots are counted in a number of states, although conclusions are slowly emerging. Trevor, I'd like to start with you and ask, why has another US election been too close to call? Whichever winner emerges, why were the margins not larger, given the controversies over the coronavirus, over the economic downturn, and issues concerning racial injustice?
Well, I think there was an expectation, particularly from, from Democrats especially, but I think people that are observing US politics, that this election would probably be a repudiation of the Trump presidency, that he'd become increasingly unpopular over the last 4 years, and particularly over this year because of, as you say, these various crises, but particularly coronavirus and his handling of that, and that we would have seen a big Biden win. And of course, that hasn't emerged, partly because the US is just such a divided country politically. And so I think what we've seen in this election, as we have in quite a lot of the recent presidential elections is that this very stark polarization between left and right in the United States and between the two main parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, is very much entrenched. Also divisions within each state of the country as well. Obviously, there are some states that do tend to go for the Democrats, others that tend to go for the Republicans. What we see within the swing states is a real difference between support for the two parties, between the suburban and city areas and the more rural areas. And it's those margins that are playing out in this election, much as they have in previous years as well. And despite all of these incredibly controversial issues that we've seen come to the foreground during this campaign, it wasn't enough to drive that support either to one candidate or the other. So it is too close to call still. As you're sort of hinting, I think we're moving towards some kind of result that might well see Joe Biden becoming president of the United States, but it's certainly not a done deal. And a lot of that comes down to this really deep political division within the country.
Well, let's further that a little bit. Matoji, over to you, please. What do you think about these divides? Is it too polarized, or can these divides be overcome?
Yes, that's a good question. That I think that the division, instead of the United States of America, now it is very much a divided States of America. And the President Trump's attacks on Biden, two words remind me. One is a socialist. He's attacking Biden as a socialist. The other one is a globalist. You see, there are two factors. One is a kind of ideology, and conservative versus, progressive or reform, the liberal. The other one is internationalism or globalism versus the kind of anti-globalism type of things. And when you see a blue and red, blue are always in the very eastern part and western part. And they are riding on the globalizations, and more kind of progressive, versus the red in the middle, who couldn't get on the bus of what is called the globalization. So the Biden is amazing that despite the 4 years of really a sort of seeing from Japan or seeing from me or from the world, what the President Trump did it is really bad for the international system. And yet it is so close to sort of the election, meaning that depth of division is so deep.
Thank you. Jordan, over to you. With this uncertainty concerning the outcome of the results, how is this going to affect foreign policy over the next few weeks?
First, I just wanted to offer a couple other takeaways on the election, including a couple positives, and then I'll talk about the foreign policy implications for the weeks ahead. I think it's worth underscoring a few positives from the election. One, turnout was exceptionally high, which is wonderful. About 2/3 of eligible American voters voted, which is the highest rate since 1900, and 1900 women couldn't vote. So if you take that into account, it's actually the highest share of Americans ever voting in a presidential election. And the voting process has pretty much gone the way it's supposed to go in terms of counting the votes, despite Trump's efforts to delegitimize it, to have votes not counted, to challenge things in the courts. So far, in some cases before the election, the courts largely ruled against Republican efforts to change voting processes. And I expect Trump's legal challenges after the election will probably fail as well. And so the institutions are generally holding up. I just want to underscore that because Trump has really, undermined American institutions and democratic norms in some ways. But I think a big takeaway of this election will be that American democratic institutions have held up in this election, and Biden will, I think be taking office in January. So that I think is good, but I'm very worried about possibilities of violence and Trump kind of fomenting, armed resistance and that sort of thing in the weeks ahead. We'll see what happens. In terms of foreign policy, I think for the remainder of the Trump presidency, the next 2 months, I think Trump and the US will remain very distracted by the election, by the aftermath of the election, by the transition, and events overseas will just not be getting attention. I think if you look at any news outlet in the United States, coverage of international news is hard to find right now. You'd have to scroll far down the page to find anything because it's so distracting, the election. So that means that there's opportunity for some countries overseas to cause trouble potentially because the US may not be as attentive or responding as much to, say, China or Russia doing something that could be troublesome. And there's also a risk of Trump trying to take some foreign policy initiatives to distract from his loss or to get a big win in foreign policy before he leaves office. I think he'll try to get some big diplomatic deal with North Korea, perhaps maybe with Russia. You know, I think he's going to want to leave office with something big to show for himself in foreign policy, and he might even provoke a conflict overseas to try to, you know, make a case that he needs to stay in office because we're in a time of international threat. All those things are real possibilities, and I worry about them. I mean, a diplomatic agreement could be good, but Trump is the kind of person who'd be willing to make concessions to foreign governments that might not be in the best interest of the United States or the world, just in order to say he got some big deal. And so I'm a little worried about that as well.
Thanks so much. Patricia, over to you. You're here in Canada. What do you think the election will mean for Canada-US relations, particularly in terms of trade relations?
Well, and I think if Donald Trump wins the election, then we can certainly expect heightened tensions to continue between the United States and Canada. That's unfortunate, but the Canadian government has had several years now to adopt strategies to work effectively despite that, and they've done that. So if Donald Trump is reelected, we will be fine. We will certainly continue to see heightened tensions on trade, I believe. Many of the listeners know that the Trump administration recently lifted tariffs on aluminum, which was a good thing, but at the same time, they promised to watch the volume of aluminum going across the border. And should that volume exceed a certain target, they might reimpose tariffs on Canadian aluminum, and they will assess that later this month if the Trump administration is in office. So that threat remains. We'd also, I believe, see some pushback on dairy. Just in recent weeks, we've seen rumblings in Washington around our commitments in USMCA and Americans concerned about our implementation of that. Certainly, if the Trump administration is in office, they will take action to make sure that we fulfill our obligations there. If Biden wins, of course, there will be much warmer relations. There are great affinities between the two governments on several files, climate change, multilateralism, etc. But that doesn't mean the irritants are going to go away. The perennial issue of softwood lumber will still be a big feature of our relationship. And of course, Joe Biden has been very vocal about introducing very strong Buy American provisions, particularly as that pertains to government procurement. And that, depending on the parameters of that will likely not be good news for Canada. So certainly warmer relations, but we won't see all of the issues go away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to follow one of your lines and just on this issue of Trump possibly winning a second term. So let's just assume for a moment that this happens. And let's look at the implications for multilateralism, international cooperation, and foreign policy. So Trevor, if this does happen and Trump does emerge the winner, either over the coming days or following a recount, how much, in your view, do you think his presidency has been weakened internationally by the close margins and his unfounded claims of fraud?
Well, I think that a lot of people across the world are looking at the claims that are being made by President Trump at the moment and thinking this is not all that surprising because he has been pretty controversial, let's face it, in the statements that he's made while he's been president. But I think it will undermine his credibility internationally, perhaps even more than many of the things that he's asserted over the last 4 years whilst president. It seems so hypocritical in some ways of a US president to claim that his own political system can't be trusted and then to try and influence foreign affairs elsewhere, and particularly when criticisms are leveled at other countries' systems of politics. And, you know, if the president is saying that his own system can't be trusted, what does that say about the sort of claims that he makes about other nations? So I think, yes, that a second term of Trump, at least initially, would get a pretty frosty reception among allies. And also, I think, as Jordan was suggesting, that the possibility that some of the more adversarial nations that the United States has relationships with in the world, you know, they might try and test a Trump presidency quite early on, thinking that he has greatly undermined his, not only his credibility internationally, but also his standing within the United States, you know, is going to be quite questionable. And particularly, I think if we see a turnout in the Senate, which is still possible, that the Democrats gain control of the Senate, then obviously that divided government is going to impact on his ability to carry out policies that are in accordance with his kind of general wishes. So yeah, I expect if there is a second term of Trump that we're going to see a much weakened president. Another thing, though, of course, is that if he does get that second term, it will be another 4 years of Trump, and it will be, or should be, his last 4 years as president, because obviously there's the 2-term limit. One thing that I think we might see from a second term Trump presidency as it develops is a much greater emphasis on legacy building, and that Trump will want to achieve those big wins that Jordan's suggesting he might push for in the next couple of months if he does end up losing this presidential election. It could be actually that a lot of the America First sort of positioning that we've seen in the first term might become a little less vociferous than it has been, and he might move to a more conciliatory position with some of the issues that he's been pressing on over the first term to get the big wins, to get the Middle East peace process moving as he's attempted to, possibly to get an agreement with North Korea, even potentially in the long run to get an agreement with Iran. So we could see quite a different Trump administration emerging if there is a second term. But I think initially he would face a lot of difficulties internationally.
Thanks for this. Jordan, your take on this. Trump gets in. New foreign policy steps?
Well, I would hope that Trevor would be right and that he would move away from his America First agenda and move in a more internationalist direction in search of some big foreign policy wins. But my worry would be that he would just be emboldened to kind of double down on his nationalist, anti-internationalist orientation. And we know he's had long-standing views along those lines. I mean, if you look back at Trump's rhetoric going back to the 1980s, he's been saying some of the same things. Other countries are ripping off the United States. The US is, shouldn't be spending so much money, propping up other countries. He's been saying that kind of stuff for decades. And so I think he'll continue to act consistent with that worldview. And I would worry that he might take some steps that would even push the US further away from internationalism, such as moving to withdraw from NATO. We know that Trump has considered pulling the US out of NATO. He talked about it with his advisors. He, on that issue, I think, was constrained by the rest of the US foreign policy establishment, by his own advisors, by cabinet officials, by Congress, who are all strongly pro-NATO. But Trump may feel like he can take that type of step if he's reelected to a second term. I think he also would be more likely to reduce the US military presence overseas in places like South Korea. He doesn't think the US should have troops stationed in places like South Korea in Europe. I think he would move more strongly in that direction. And I think he might take more bold steps to strengthen ties with some authoritarian governments like Russia, the Putin government, which he would like to have closer relations with. He's, again, on that issue, been constrained by Congress and by his own advisors, who are more concerned about Russia. But I think he may feel emboldened and he can take some steps that really change the course of US policy in a more dramatic way on an issue like US relations with Russia. And so I would expect him to try to do some of those things in the second term.
Thank you. Patricia, we've had Jordan mention NATO. What about the World Trade Organization? This is an organization that President Trump has maligned over the last 4 years. What are the prospects for this, given this scenario?
Well, the prospects are probably not great. Certainly, Donald Trump has made it clear that he is not a fan of international organizations when he perceives that their work runs counter to US interests. And that was his argument in withdrawing from the WHO, his argument in withdrawing from the Paris Accords, et cetera. The WTO has been a particular target for Donald Trump and his US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer. And they've taken some significant action that has not the WTO is still functioning, but they have taken some significant action to hobble it. In particular, they have recently hobbled the appellate body function by refusing to appoint new appellate body judges when the terms were ending for sitting appellate body members. And so as of December 2019, the appellate body of the WTO is not functioning. More recently, we've been watching the race for Director General of the WTO, and there's been a long process to try to build consensus around a candidate. And indeed, consensus was built among the 164 members of the WTO. Consensus among 163 emerged around the Nigerian candidate, but the US under Trump has indicated that they will veto her. So that is a bump in the road if we have a Biden administration, but that could potentially turn into something very serious under a Trump administration if they persist in insisting on their own candidate, the South Korean candidate, who is, by the way, very well qualified, but with a consensus process at the WTO, the preference is that all members agree. So the hope is that a Trump administration would be brought around to joining a reform process. No WTO watcher believes that the WTO shouldn't be reformed. It should, and the hope would be that a second Trump administration would join that effort rather than trying to foil it.
Thanks, Patricia. Matoji, Trump gets in. What are the broader impacts for international cooperation in your view?
Yes, indeed, 4 more years. Wow. And surprisingly enough, that he's very popular in Japan. And you see, what you saw is that Abe-Trump relations, former Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, and Trump, one of the most, I think, amicable friends. They played golf together very often. So he's pretty popular, and he doesn't say very nasty things to Japan, in contrast to what he said about against Germany. Although the situation is very similar, Germany and Japan are on the kind of size of a trade deficit, and also that each country is spending on the defense in terms of GDP, rather restrained. But in any case, my point here is that, well, Mr. Trump, President Trump, in the last 4 years, really undermined the kind of international cooperation system which have nurtured in the post-World War II era of over 70-some years. And I say that international cooperative system, there are 2 sort of a subsystem. One is a multilateral free trading system, and the other one is alliance. With these 2 sort of subsystems, somehow America-centered international cooperative system survived. And it worked very well for the maintenance of peace, and also maybe for the world economic progresses. But that system has been very much strained and almost gone, in a sense, as the President France says NATO is a brain dead type of things. You know, it's alarming because alliance must be the one that you have to show to the world or to the enemy that this is working. But that sort of a partner is saying brain dead, meaning that, there's no deterrence for that matters. Well, Japan, so far it's okay. It was okay, but I said to Japanese people, NATO is so much restrained, and how can you say that we're okay, type of things. So the next 4 years, I don't know how he's going to do that matters, but certainly that you can't judge in a very, very reasoned, the calculated way. He does it from his own sort of gut feeling type of things. And we don't know where to go. If it is in this part of East Asia, Taiwan is a very focal point, or US-China relations for that matters. But Taiwan, seen from President Trump's side, they're good sort of the customer, buying a lot of sort of American and equipment type of things. But I just wonder whether he has a pretty good sort of understanding for China and what it means to Taiwan. And is US ready to confront, in any case, supporting Taiwan? which also I doubted. In the international free trading system, of course, it's almost multilateral, meaning is almost gone. So another 4 years, certainly that the WTO will lose the foundation for that matters. I was in Marrakech in 1994. Maybe it was high time for WTO, the founding, and also the free trade system. But since then, but in particular in the last 4 years, we have seen so much strain for that matters.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to turn this situation around now. Biden gets in. What does this mean for international cooperation, multilateralism, and foreign policy? So Jordan, first to you, what areas would Biden would Biden consider as quick wins for him? What areas might he have difficulties in?
Sure. And first, I just think that by far the most important thing Biden would achieve in foreign policy is just sending a strong signal to the world that the U.S. is still committed to international engagement, international cooperation, more than on any specific issue. I think that signal is just so important to kind of prevent further erosion of the liberal international order and create a foundation for cooperation and new partnerships to address the key global challenges out there, from pandemic to climate change. I think there are some things that he can do right away and where he'll be able to have a very concrete effect. He can re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. He can re-enter the World Health Organization. He can negotiate an extension of the New START nuclear arms control agreement with Russia. Those are all things that he is committed to do and should be able to do. He, on climate change, will be able to use his executive authority to restore some regulations that Trump had lifted and impose new regulations, for instance, to regulate automobile emissions. That's something that's important to address climate change. But climate change is also an area where he'll have a really tough road ahead, because to address climate change most effectively, the US Congress needs to pass legislation more systematically restricting greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and it'll be extremely difficult for Biden to get Congress to enact that type of legislation. I think he'll also have trouble with Iran, in the sense of it's going to become a new issue again. How should we address Iran's nuclear program? Can we restore the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA from 2015? Iran no longer trusts the United States, and so to kind of get back into a nuclear agreement with Iran is going to be very, very challenging.
Thanks so much. Patricia, any views on trade with Europe, US-European trade? Is there scope for a new deal here?
The US-European relations, I think, will be a really interesting file under a Biden administration. Of course, they've been very tense under the Trump administration with not just tariff threats, but tariffs imposed against different European sectors. I believe that will go away. Those sorts of tensions will go away. But of course, as with Canada, there are some thorny issues between the US and the EU on the trade front. The Boeing Airbus issue continues. Just recently, the EU was authorized to impose close to $4 billion worth of tariffs, retaliatory tariffs on the United States. They haven't done so yet. The hope would be that a Biden administration would find some sort of negotiated settlement there. We also see a looming challenge on the imposition of a digital tax in Europe, both at the EU level and at national level. Various Europeans would like to impose that, which will of course hit US tech companies pretty hard. There has been a process in the OECD, which the Trump administration abandoned. However, we might expect a Biden administration to re-enter those discussions on the digital tax at the multilateral level. On trade deals, and there are probably two that are worth mentioning. The Trump administration has already completed 5 rounds of discussions towards a US-UK trade deal. And so one might expect the Biden administration to continue with that. However, Biden and other Democrats have been very clear that any sort of US-UK trade deal is contingent upon a certain sort of Brexit. So any sort of Brexit that might jeopardize the peace in Northern Ireland, or might jeopardize the Good Friday Accords that brought peace to Northern Ireland, would be unacceptable. And so I think we're going to have to see a Brexit first, with no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, before we get completion of any sort of US-UK agreement. Just before, and the last thing I'll say, just before, of course, Donald Trump halted talks between the US and the EU toward the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I don't think we'll see a revival of that in the near term. Just last month, the Director General of Trade for the EU, Sabine Weyand, had said that she didn't see that as a priority, that what she felt would be better under a Biden administration would be the US and the EU working together at the WTO and on other fronts, both to respond to China and to prompt some sort of economic recovery from COVID. So I don't anticipate a revival of US-EU talks.
Thank you very much. Mitoji, over to you. What do you think, from where you sit in Asia, are the prospects for further international cooperation or reinvestment in international cooperation under a Biden administration?
Yes, I hope that he will bring a kind of a sort of a disorder of this kind of international system back to more orderly ones. But at the same time, I have a rather strong reservations where it will go. We don't know yet. Number one, that if it is international corporations, as I say, the multilateral free trading system is one thing. The other one is a kind of alliance system, or meaning that US commitment to overseas. When it comes to the multilateral free trading system, I don't know, the Democrats within the Democratic Party, more progressive, the groups of the people. There are a lot of wings in the Democrats, I understand. And quite a few of those sort of progressive people, not necessarily a great supporter of this multilateral free trading system, including TPP, for example, which in Japan is very much a party for that matters. As to the kind of alliance type of things, I recall that the President Obama said, we are not, America is not anymore world policeman type of things, and do care about our sort of own problems. That's a kind of sort of a lot of sort of the echo of the ordinary people's, the kind of shared positions. If it is the case, I don't know how much of sort of great capacity this Biden administration will have it to work more positively with kind of the rest of the world group of people, including Japan. But certainly, the attitudes is totally different. He'll try to talk, and he's a decent person. So I see that we're going to see a bit more sort of normal life of diplomacy.
Thank you so much. Trevor, over to you. If Biden emerges, will his political capital be reduced and make it more difficult for him to build an effective administration?
Well, I think he'll certainly have a lot of political capital in foreign capitals, and that sort of the reverse of what I was saying about Donald Trump. I think that there'll be a great outpouring of welcome for Joe Biden should he become the president of the United States. And I think the way in which he's conducting himself as well through this period of doubt as these votes are counted is probably contributing to the sense that he will be, as Mitoji was saying, a decent president, and that he will seek to engage with other countries. The amount of political capital it will have internally within the United States, though, could have a knock-on effect for his foreign affairs. A lot of it does hinge on what happens with those last couple of Senate seats. I think it's possible that there'll be some runoff elections for the Georgia Senate seats that could lead to the Democrats regaining control of the Senate. I think if that happens, and the Democrats have both houses of Congress, then we're going to see a lot more, obviously, political unity within the United States, and that might assist with some of those sort of trade negotiations that Patricia was talking about, some of the treaty re-engagements that Biden would be interested in as well, that Jordan had mentioned. But there are those divisions within the Democratic Party as well. So I think Biden is going to have quite a difficult job of trying to straddle between the centrist positions that he feels more comfortable with in international affairs, and the push that he's going to get from the progressive wing of the party, which won't necessarily match with his priorities. But in order to keep that that unity at home, he's going to have to sort of adhere to some of the pressures that come out of the left. So particularly, I think on human rights, there's going to be a much more hard push to hold China and other countries, perhaps in the Middle East, to account, such as Saudi Arabia, in ways that perhaps there hasn't been for the last 4 years.
Well, let's just extend on that thought and recognize that the tensions between the US and China have been quite high for the last 4 years. Biden will have to confront this. Jordan, give us your views on whether you think it might be possible for Biden to restore the US reputation to what it was under Obama with regards to its relationship with China.
I think Biden will strengthen the US reputation internationally, across the board. That will include with China, and Biden will be able to work much more effectively with countries around the world than Trump has been able to do. I think to fully restore the US international reputation to where it was under Obama will take more than 4 years, though. I think other countries around the world, even with Biden in the White House, will not be able to put as much faith in US commitments as they did before because of the approach that Trump has taken. And I think it'll frankly take the election of another internationalist in 2024 to get the US reputation back to where it was under Obama.
Patricia, what about your thoughts on trade relations and the past trade wars between China and the US? Is there scope for improvement here?
Sure. I think the short answer is Biden will have very similar goals as Donald Trump had, but he will go about achieving them in a different way. So Biden will still want to try and coax change in Chinese economic policy, even structural change in the Chinese economic model. He'll want to be protecting the American worker. He'll want to still ideally keep the market open for American businesses, all the while thinking about human rights issues and security issues. So he has the same very difficult challenge. I just predict he won't do it through a trade war. Biden has criticized the tariffs and he's criticized the Phase 1 China deal. So he will find other ways to do it, including multilaterally.
Mitoji, your thoughts on the prospects for improved relations between China and the US?
Well, I think that this US-China relations today is a hegemonic rivalry. So it's going to be a very long-lasting sort of competition between two powers. And, it is amazing that the Americans' perception toward China aggravated very much in the last 2-3 years. Now, nearly 73% of Americans have a negative view toward China. So it is both sides problems. Yes, and the President Trump, the way he's handling it, but also that the Chinese reactions are their behaviors. They behave as if that, yes, they are superpower type of things, but they have to also understand, they have to behave, and they have to respect international order type of things. So both sides have a lot of problems. I hope that there will be a bit more sort of reasonable the meeting of minds between two underpowers. We are in the middle of that sort of the situations, Japan, US, and China. Of course, the alliance with the United States is so critical to our security. Also, China for us is a very important market. And China is now approaching to us in view of, because this very heated the US-China rivalry, that China is now coming to us with a big smile type of things. So how Japan should behave or make a decision. I say that Japan on its own positions make it clear that we work hard for the peace of Asia, and we go for kind of a peace offensive. Go to China, try to work out something very meaningful for the stability of the East Asia. That also should help Mr. Biden, for that matters, the new administration.
Thank you. Trevor, same to you, but broaden it out to other difficult partners, not just China, but what does the future hold under Biden with adversarial relationships like Russia as well, Iran?
Well, I think the approach will be very different from the one that we've seen under Trump with all of those adversaries, in that I think the general approach of a Biden administration is going to be much more engaging with adversaries and trying to find common ground where there is common ground, but holding them to account on the multitude of issues that the United States feels out of step with the interests that the US has. And so with Russia, for example, I think the Biden administration is likely to want to have a relatively cooperative relationship with Russia, but it will definitely be pressing hard on a range of issues relating to Russian sort of ambitions, particularly in the Middle East. And a lot of that pressure, again, will come out of Democratic members of Congress, and particularly I think on the left of the party, who really do feel quite strongly about the Russian threat to the United States and will want a Biden administration to be a bit more clear cut, I think, in its position than perhaps the Trump administration has, where obviously that close personal relationship that we've seen between Putin and Trump has cast doubts over what the sort of degree of firmness that the US is going to take with Russia. But I think generally it's that difference in the approach. It's the way that a Biden administration will be much more interested in a multilateral approach to foreign affairs, taking into account the views of its allies and trying to engage properly in diplomacy. I mean, I think that's really, the major difference here is that Biden will take seriously the way that diplomacy should be carried out in the international realm in ways that we just haven't seen, at least on a personal level, from Donald Trump.
Let's talk about the global international order, or the rules-based order, liberal international order. Historically, the United States has not only been the chief architect of this order, but the guardian of it as well. But it seems that under President Trump, the US has not only abdicated leadership of this order, but has actively undermined it. So Jordan, I'd like to direct this first question to you. To what extent would a second term for Trump herald a permanent collapse of the liberal international order, the already wounded liberal international order?
Yeah, it certainly is wounded. I wouldn't want to go as far as saying that the re-election of Trump would necessarily herald the permanent collapse of the international order, but it would certainly further weaken it. It would just send a very strong signal in a negative way for the country that was, at the heart of this international order for so many decades, to re-elect a president whose approach to world affairs is so different than the values and norms that underpin the existing international order. And of course, there have been developments in other parts of the world and other countries that are going in the same direction, the election of populists and nationalists in other countries. So this hasn't just been a phenomenon in the United States. On the other hand, there are still signs of for hope, in the sense that American public opinion remains largely internationalist. So Trump's foreign policy approach is actually out of sync with where most Americans are. Most Americans are more supportive of international engagement than Trump is. And so there's still a kind of base of potential political support for the kind of internationalism that Biden represents. And also, the US isn't the only country that's relevant here. Other countries can still maintain aspects of the international order without the United States. We've already seen that. That will continue in the years ahead.
Patricia, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I really agree with Jordan on that. Certainly, a Trump administration is not going to be good for the liberal international order, but I'm not convinced that the resilience of the order rests solely on US action. And so we could see continuation of various aspects of it, even under a Trump leadership. The other question that strikes me as interesting is whether Biden would be able to restore it, and whether he would necessarily want to restore it in some old form. It seems to me that under a Biden administration, there'd be a wonderful opportunity to rethink how we might make sure that the future order the benefits of it can be distributed more widely. Those who have not necessarily benefited from the old order would be included in some sort of redesigned, updated set of rules and principles. So I would seize upon the opportunity as a positive thing, as opposed to the possible collapse as a negative thing.
Thank you. Mitoji, any comments from you? No, we're...
Yes, here we are. I was a Sherpa for G8 summit for some years, worked for my prime minister. And the G7 in particular was a sort of group of countries of shared values or among advanced democracies. But I don't think that President Trump didn't care much about sort of those kind of shared values. He loves the power. He loves the big guy type of things. So President Putin, or even Kim Jong-un, a very good friend of that looks like President Trump, and that is also another aspect of the wounding international kind of system, and also shared values. And for example, in the aftermath of the Hong Kong, we're very much concerned, and how much American Trump administration care about that. And that kind of sort of the developments and the hope, if it is the new administration will be under President Biden, it will be more sort of the kind of shared values type of things will be recovered. And we have to show to the world, yes, indeed, not power alone, but more reasons. The democracy, the shared values are also very important factors in carrying out this kind of international relations. And I hope that we'll go back to that kind of system once again.
Thank you. Trevor, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's just worth. I think it's worth remembering that it's not just Donald Trump that makes U.S. foreign policy even. So I think that there are other forces at play within the United States that have this wish to maintain the international liberal order and want the United States to remain a major player within it. So if Trump did try to dismantle more fully some of those aspects, especially some of the really important relationships that the US has within NATO and other international organizations, I think the resistance from Congress would really be quite significant. And who Trump ends up picking as his sort of foreign policy team in a second term as well might also have an influence. We know at various points in his first term, some of those characters that perhaps are no longer there because he fired them, but while they were in the White House, were able to try to resist some of Trump's more outlandish ideas about how he might change the way that international affairs operated. And I think whoever ends up being alongside Mike Pompeo, who seems to be likely to stay, but some of the other characters might change, that again might be a way of maintaining the level of engagement that we would expect from the United States without it being entirely dictated to by the president.
Great. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. First one, Trevor, I'm going to route to you because you are a security expert. How would you, Trevor, see or assess the differences between Trump versus Biden administration on kinetic deployments to deter authoritarian adventurism by Russia in the east of Europe and China in the South China Sea and the Asia Pacific region?
Wow, that's a very specific kind of question. I mean, I think that that Biden is although we've been suggesting that he would be much more sort of diplomatic in his approach, it would be wrong to think that he's not going to have a strong emphasis on security. He was very much a supporter of many of the steps that the Obama administration took to try to strengthen US security measures in the Middle East, especially, but in other parts of the world as well. And I think would be threatening force and would have the will to use force if necessary to try to hold the line against any kind of advancements that China or Russia might try to make into, you know, influencing various the various conflicts that might come about within the regions that we're talking about there. So I think actually, you know, if there's any sense that somehow Biden is going to be less of a powerful president in terms of his national security, that's not the case. I think he's very much a president who believes that the United States needs to have a strong military, that it needs to project its power internationally. So we would still see a pretty strong national security position coming from a Biden administration.
Thank you. Patricia, given COVID-19, the question says, could the election of Biden represent an opportunity for the resurgence of international aid? In your view, how does the election affect the balance between getting the virus under control in the domestic context and the efforts to support the international context?
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure that getting the virus under control will necessarily, in a one-to-one way, lead to more aid. If our efforts to get the virus under control are increasingly at the multilateral level, then we might be looking both at how we need to take care of that internally, inside our own borders, and outside of our own borders. So I think maybe the intervening piece there is if under a Biden administration, we are once again multilateral in our approach to dealing with COVID and increasingly our recovery from it, then we might be more other-centered in how we come out of it.
Great. Jordan, question for you here. If Trump loses but contests or refuses to acknowledge the results, what role will foreign leaders' congratulations/acknowledgement of Biden win play in shaping global public opinion as to the legitimacy of a Biden win?
I think it's without doubt that Trump's questioning of the legitimacy of the result will not carry sway internationally, and global public opinion will be very against Trump. It will look like Trump is trying to steal the election. And the statements of foreign leaders can only, you know, enhance that that reality. But I think the international media coverage will be very negative of any efforts by Trump to delegitimize the election results. And certainly foreign leaders can, you know, further contribute to that by congratulating Biden, acknowledging Biden as the president-elect, and Trump is going to have no international public support for efforts to delegitimize the election.
Thank you very much. Matoji, question for you. How do you believe the administrations in places like China and Russia assess the American will to deploy troops and to deploy, instruments of power, coercive and co-optive?
Mm-hmm. Well, as Jordan pointed out, that the American in general is sort of supportive kind of engagement with the international community. That's a very encouraging sort of a word for me. I hope that will be the case. And also that in terms of when you say forces, the militaries, and the Americans are ready to send boys overseas, I think that will be more restrained sort of the posture, not just by Trump supporters, but also the Democrats are not so sort of supportive of that kind of engagement. More broadly, the engagement to international sort of system, I think that's what Jordan pointed out, but not very much in the world of actual sort of the deployment of the forces overseas. So to that extent, it is rather restrained. But also at the same time, China, for example, they of course don't want to get involved with Americans, a kind of conflict type of things. Confrontation, yes, but not military conflict. Also both their sides as well as also Russians. So I think that we can work out something that being engaged in a kind of a more diplomatic or under the kind of a sort of engagement type of approaches, we can find some kind of a middle ground, even with a kind of those kind of the difficult partners. That I think will be the case.
Thank you very much. Jordan, back to you. A question that says, what will another Trump term mean for climate change?
Well, nothing good. I mean, Trump is not interested in addressing the problem of climate change. Under Trump, the U.S. is not going to be making any significant commitments to address climate change. It will be out of the Paris Climate Accord. It will not play a useful role in further negotiations for follow-on agreements which are needed. Of course, the Paris Climate Accord doesn't come close to fully resolving the climate change problem. And so U.S. just won't be a player, and it'll just be a question of to what extent can the rest of the world carry forward the climate change agenda without the United States, and that will be essential if Trump is reelected.
Thank you. Trevor, a question for you on Brexit and Trump. Could a Trump presidency assist or boost the hard Brexit narrative that is popular in some conservative circles in the UK, i.e. is Biden bad for Brexit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You know, I've been hearing some Conservative MPs being interviewed on the radio over the last couple of days and saying very supportive things about Donald Trump becoming the next president of the United States. And that's largely because they do think that, he will be more understanding of the positions that the Conservative Party wants to take with regard to Brexit. And as was mentioned earlier, the question over the hard border in Northern Ireland especially is one that there are concerns about what Biden's position would be and whether the US would be putting what would be seen by Boris Johnson's government as undue kind of influence over the outcome of the Brexit negotiations. So I think there are those within the Conservative Party who would much rather see a second Trump term. And Dominic Raab, actually, as our foreign secretary, has quite publicly refused to denounce the statements made by Trump about this being a stolen election, again, when he was interviewed by the media. So yes, it does appear that there is some interest, at least within some political circles in the UK, to see a second Trump term.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out one question to all of you, just wrapping up, acknowledging that there are policymakers in the audience today. What would be the top tip you would leave the policy community with? Starting with you, Jordan.
I would say don't give up on the United States. If you're a policymaker in another country, or just a citizen of another country, the US politics have looked really bad the last 4 years. Trump has been a terrible leader, but there is still a base of support in the United States for international engagement, for international cooperation. Biden exemplifies that. He's a classic internationalist. I think he, as president, will be able to make some strides in that direction, but just kind of try to work with the United States still, even though our country's having so many problems.
Thank you. Matoji, your top tip for the policy community.
The American resilience the journal talked about, I hope that will be the case. Resilience of the American system will survive. And I hope that the US is committed to the world. And so long as Japan is concerned, we're very much committed to work with the United States and Trump, Biden, otherwise. But nonetheless, I don't want to see any kind of last minute, the surprise visit to Pyongyang type of things, no. And hope that we'll have a more coordinated responses to the international issues as well.
Great, thank you very much. Trevor, top tip for the international policy world.
Probably hold your breath, wait for the outcome to be negotiated over the next few days. Come January, there could well be a new administration coming in. Even if there isn't, then I think, the messages we've been saying that there's still an awful lot of different elements of the political class within the United States and the non-political class especially, who are very engaged with the rest of the world, want to have cooperative and positive relations with other parts of the world. And that is, I think, still predominantly the position of most Americans, and that although the political cycle can sometimes bring some quite interesting outcomes, ultimately that engagement with the rest of the world will be there, and it might just be a case of being quite patient over a longer period of time if you do get a second Trump term, but it will come around again. It does every time. look back at the Bush years, look back at the Reagan years, we ended up with different leaders and different attitudes that followed.
Finish us off, Patricia.
Well, I really agree with my colleagues, and I agree with Trevor that we're just going to have to be patient. I do think we're at an inflection point in US history. We've got these two broad visions for the country, and certainly the work of a Biden administration would be to try to reconcile them, find some common ground, and really try to heal that frayed fabric of US society. And that's going to take some time. And in the meantime, we have no choice but to continue protecting our own interests and pursuing our own policy objectives, ideally, I hope, with a deep understanding of these divisions in the United States and how they are influencing US policy and how they will for I think, quite some time to come.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. It's been an excellent panel. You've been brilliant. Keep up the great work. I'm sure the audience will agree this was a great discussion. We hope that you will all join us next week, same time, same place, and same link for an equally interesting discussion entitled Asia, the West, and the Global Economy, Promise or Peril. Until then, thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.